Hello everybody. Here's something cautionary about Baha'is and the word century. Later I will go into the nonsense about 20th century and then into world peace or lesser peace and the unity of nations. Here's a spoiler. It's a shambles, a blunder, a misser, a clanger, a flop. On the bright side, it is an education. 25 years ago, as the world was grappling with the supposed year 2000 problem with computer systems, the Baha'is had their own problems with the non-occurrence of things supposedly prophesied for the 20th century. What do you do when prophecy fails? If I'm reading the signs aright, in 2019, the Universal House of Justice changed course and no longer claims that anything remarkable happened in the world in the year 2000. Rather than having achieved unity of nations, the world is going to hell in a handcart pulled by three devils. The House of Justice says that the year 2000 optimism has been run over by the resurgent forces of racism, nationalism, and factionalism, which is what our eyes tell us when we look around. There's neither peace nor unity on the horizon. So what is it, or what was it about Baha'is and the word century? By Baha'is and the word century, I mean English-speaking Baha'is, because century is an English word, and I mean particularly the monolingual English speakers. Because if we're talking French, un siècle is not necessarily 100 years. Siècle comes from saeculum and refers to a generation, and so on with other languages. The more languages you know, the more chance you have to skirt around the word traps laid in the path of reading and understanding. Language learning is yoga for the understanding. It keeps you limber. Abdu'l-Baha was particularly fond of centuries. The century of Baha'u'llah, the century of light, the century of mysteries, the new century, the century of universal and permanent peace, the century of the Abha beauty, the century of the Almighty Lord, the century of life and renewal, this great century of the light of God. Of all of these centuries, the Baha'is have fixed mainly on the century of light. So I'm going to call this video Century of Mysteries, just to be contrary. I like being contrary, it makes people think. Because he's writing and speaking in Persian, Abdu'l-Baha is not literally saying century. He's saying asra, or karn, two words that he uses as synonyms. Neither word means 100 years. They are more like the French siècle, which can be made more specific with a number or an adjective. There is un siècle d'or Nederlandais, the Dutch Golden Age from 1585 to 1702, and there's le 20e siècle, which is the 20th century. Persian is the same. Asra can be qualified by a number, such as the 12th century solar, which is the 100 years beginning January 6, 1822, or it could be the 12th century lunar, which begins on November 4th, 1785 and ends in 1882. Or Asra can be qualified by an adjective. Asra Qajar is the Qajar era, the 136 years when the Shahs, the kings of Iran, ruled Persia. So to be more precise, Abdu'l-Baha is fond of the words Asra and Karn, and his translators often turned it into a century, and sometimes a dispensation, an age or time, or a generation or a day. Shoghi Effendi used all these translations, but age is his usual translation, not century. The translator's choice is followed by a reader's choice. We, the readers, have to understand what is meant using our own intelligence, or we don't use our intelligence. in which case we get grown, silly ideas that are attributed to Abdu'l-Baha and passed on as the Baha'i teachings. So let's start with a hypothetical example of really stupid reading and see why it would be stupid. In 1892, Abdu'l-Baha wrote a book about the relationship between religion and politics, which I have translated as the art of governance. In the final summing up, he addresses the Baha'is saying, "O friends of God, the faith of God is in its youth, the wondrous cause is in vernal glory. The new century, Asra, is a tender young tree. This century, Karn, is the chosen century of the one true God." My hypothetical, thoughtless English reader would be one who looked at the date of composition, 1892, and concluded that God's chosen century must have started in 1800 and ended in 1900, so that's over now. We can write reviews of Baha'i developments in the chosen century and think up good excuses why they didn't work out as expected by the year 1900. That would be thoughtless is the kindest word for that reading. It's wrong in three ways. First, it supposes that Abdu'l-Baha and God use the calendar of Pope Gregory. God is clearly a European, and God chose our 19th century, not an Islamic or Hebrew or some heathen century. Second, it fails to see that this century, in this sentence, could not be a period of 100 years, as if God closes the door of grace on a certain day, like the Pope at the end of the year of Jubilee. And third, it supposes that there was something religiously significant for Baha'is about the beginning of the chosen century in 1800. 1800 AD is not a significant date for Baha'i history, so why would the chosen century begin in 1800? This is exactly the thoughtless reading that many Baha'is have applied to Abdu'l-Baha's Century of Light. They suppose it is a Gregorian century. They suppose that his Persian words Asra and Khan translate as 100 years, with a definite beginning and end. And they have not asked, what exactly was it that started the 100 years of light they imagine in the year 1900? Such questions would have led them to understand what Abdu'l-Baha really meant. He meant the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, not a period of 100 years, and not the 20th century. Abdu'l-Baha tells us in Some Answered Questions, page 64, that his century means the cycle of Baha'u'llah. He says, "Now consider, in this great century which is the cycle of Baha'u'llah, what progress science and knowledge have made." The dispensation of Baha'u'llah, the cycle of Baha'u'llah, began with very significant events in 1863, and it's far too soon to write the reviews. That is what Abdu'l-Baha calls the century of mystery, the century of light. You can do a bit of a search and find some well-intentioned and some learned and some very important Baha'is who have written thoughtless things about the 20th century being the century of light, world peace by the year 2000, and so on. But is it just thoughtless readers who are to blame for the Baha'i great disappointment in the year 2000? Maybe we should instead blame the translators. In my translation of Abdu'l-Baha's Art of Governance, I avoided the word century. In the published version, the lines I quoted before, written in 1892, read, "The new era is a tender young tree. This age is the chosen age of the one true God." I simply avoided the word century because there are good alternatives that are not more exact than the original. A translation should never be more narrow in meaning than the original. Abdu'l-Baha's translators could have done the same. They did not have to turn Asra and Karn into century. Shoghi Effendi was later to use age in many places, or dispensation, day, cycle, and in one crucial place, Abdu'l-Baha's 7 Candles letter, he translates it with century. We'll get back to that and what he later explained about the meaning. To understand is to forgive. Let's go back to the early 1900s and see why Baha'i translators often used century when Abdu'l-Baha could not have been referring to a period of 100 years. In the following section, we will see how some readers later came to associate century with the Gregorian 20th century, ending in the year 2000. The earliest indication I have that Baha'i translators were using century to refer to the day or era of Baha'u'llah is in a letter from Abdu'l-Baha to Ernest Rogers, then a school student, and his mother. It refers to the Great Century. From the context, it must be dated 1899. An English translation is contained in the Allah Cooper compilation of notes and materials, but I have not found the Persian original. Because the letter to Ernest Rogers was not published, it cannot have had much influence. So how did it become standard practice to translate Asra with century in the first decades of the 20th century? One bit of evidence is in Abdu'l-Baha's commentary on the 11th chapter of Isaiah in Some Answered Questions, or more precisely, in the French version, Les Leçons de Saint John d'Acre. In the 1981 French version, he says, Remarquez, aujourd'hui dans ce siècle sublime, qui est le cycle de Baha'u'llah, combien les sciences et les connaissances ont fait de progrès. Now, I would like to show you the 1908 French version on the screen, but I don't have it here. However, the 1981 French edition does not indicate that the 1908 version has been revised. So I suppose that the words I mispronounced are also the 1908 text. I once compared the French and English versions of 1908, and I concluded that the 1908 English version probably relied on the French translation. The 1908 English translation is the words I quoted previously. Now consider, in this great century, Asra, which is the cycle, Karn, of Baha'u'llah, what progress science and knowledge have made. You see, the French word siècle has turned into century, but a thoughtful reader will see it is not a century of 100 years, because it is also the cycle of Baha'u'llah, which has barely begun. In the 2014 revised edition of Some Answered Questions, this becomes, now in this glorious age, which is the century of Baha'u'llah, consider how far knowledge and learning have progressed. They've kept the word century, but moved it to the century of Baha'u'llah, which makes it less likely that those thoughtless readers I mentioned before will think, the 20th century. So that's some progress. It's not only Dreyfus and Barney, translators of Some Answered Questions in 1908, who would be influenced by French. So far as I know, all the translators for European languages who worked for Abdu'l-Baha, up to and including Shoghi Effendi, learned French before they learned English. Either they studied in Beirut, in a francophone environment, or they learned French from a tutor in the home of Abdu'l-Baha, or they attended the francophone schools of the Lasallian brothers in Haifa or Alexandria. One possible exception is Ahmad Sohrab, whose education is obscure. If anyone knows more, let me know in the comments. The translation with the greatest influence on the convention of using century in the sense of an age or era is undoubtedly the letter from Abdu'l-Baha that we know as the Candles of Unity. Abdu'l-Baha wrote this in reply to a letter from Mrs. Alexander White of Edinburgh, who had visited Abdu'l-Baha in Akka in 1903 or 1906. Accounts differ on the date of the visit. Later, she wrote a letter to Abdu'l-Baha and received his reply. I've discussed the Seven Candles tablet in a YouTube video here on June 11th, 2024, under the heading The Seven Candles. You might also want to look at Century's End on my Baha'i Studies blog, and also Century of Light. And there is more related content at the bottom of each posting on my blog. My blog is designed to have the effect of a second-hand bookshop, where you can wander through the shelves all afternoon. Don't get lost in there. Here I'm going to focus more on how this Seven Candles letter reached the Baha'i community, and how it was interpreted by various authors, and then in 1941 by Shoghi Effendi. A first translation of most of Abdu'l-Baha's reply was published in April 1907 in the Review of Reviews for London, Volume 35, number 208. A typescript of the Seven Candles is in the US Baha'i Archives, where it is incorrectly filed as a pilgrim's note from 1903. It states that Mrs. White visited Akka in February 1903, and it has the same translation as the Review of Reviews version, which reads, "The fifth light is the union of nationalities, and in this century the union of brotherhood will appear in absolute might. At last all the people of the world will consider themselves as natives of one country." This is exactly what the Review of Reviews published in April 1907, under the title The Persian Messiah. The archive typescript is one of several indications I found showing that typed copies of the 1907 Review translation circulated in North America. It could be influential from April 1907. This translation was published again in Reality magazine in November 1921, which states that the translation was made by M. F. Amin, which would be Mirza Farid Amin, a westernization of the name of Aminullah Farid. Although this information comes 14 years after the first publication, I take it as plausible that Farid was the translator. When the 1907 translation of the Seven Candles was made, Farid was in Chicago. There are numerous letters of Abdu'l-Baha and other materials translated by Farid at that time, which he dated with a reference to Chicago. Complete or partial translations that include the fifth candle, the Unity of Nations candle with the promise of this century, were published in the Baha'i World Volume 2 for 1926 to 1928, and in Volumes 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 13, spanning the years 1933 to 1964. However, the publication most accessible to readers at that time would have been the one in Baha'i Scriptures, published in 1923. This reads, "The fifth light is the union of nations. In this century the union of brotherhood will appear in absolute might. At last all the people of the world will consider themselves natives of one country." The fifth candle section, and others, was retranslated by Shoghi Effendi in a letter called The Goal of a New World Order, which was available to readers by early 1932. By that time, English readers had had ready access to the text in Baha'i Scriptures for 8 years. Shoghi Effendi made changes in the earlier translation, but he kept "in this century." His translation reads, "The fifth candle is the unity of nations, a unity which in this century will be securely established, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland. In this part of the goal of a new world order, Shoghi Effendi attributes the world's crises to a failure to reshape world systems in the light of Baha'u'llah's principles of the oneness of mankind, which implies a world federation based on a pact of disarmament and mutual defense. He quotes Abdu'l-Baha's assurance that world peace on this basis is possible, and then quotes the Seven Candles, saying that technological advances and international ties make a world federation necessary and possible. Hence, the unity of all mankind can in this day be achieved. Verily, this is none other but one of the wonders of this wondrous age, Asra, this glorious century, Karn. Of this past ages have been deprived, for this century, Karn, the century of light, has been endowed with unique and unprecedented glory. And then come the Seven Candles. Shoghi Effendi wrote The Goal of a New World Order in November 1931. A more illuminating example showing what Shoghi Effendi thought this century and this wondrous age meant, and what the fifth candle, the unity of nations, would entail, comes almost 10 years later in the letter called The Promised Day Has Come in March 1941. But before we go there, we should look at what Baha'i authors had been saying about the 20th century before 1941. Because Shoghi Effendi was in constant dialogue with the English-speaking and Persian-speaking communities. He hears and reads what is going on, and sometimes he responds and corrects. One thing that was going on was that this century was morphing into the 20th century, but not for all Baha'is equally. Let's first look at the translation convention after the Seven Candles, with Asra and Karn being translated as century. On November 13, 1911, Abdu'l-Baha gave a talk in Paris on the principle of the abolition of prejudices. In the Star of the West version, he says, I hope that this luminous century, Asra, the divine light will shed radiance over the whole world, and that the divine bounty will seek out every man. The translator in this case would probably be Hippolyte Dreyfus Barney, translating the spoken Persian into a French version, which was later translated into English by Lady Blomfield and her daughters. One swallow does not make a summer, but perhaps the convention of translating Asra and Karn as century began with an English translation from the French. In Asra in Persian becomes ce siècle in French, which then became this century in English, and then the widely read Star of the West version of this 1911 talk, and later editions of the talks of Abdu'l-Baha in Paris, influenced other translations. This is not a proof, but I offer it to anyone else who would like to redo my research more thoroughly, that the translation convention could have arisen in a double translation, and also to bear in mind that Shoghi Effendi learned French before he learned English, and was a prize-winning pupil in French a few years after 1911. There is a detectable French influence in Shoghi Effendi's earlier translations, but that is another story, and it comes after the time when Abdu'l-Baha's talks and letters were first being translated and published. One early example is Abdu'l-Baha's words to a reporter who happened to be on the steamer Cedric. This is April the 4th, 1912, on the 11th day of the voyage to America. Abdu'l-Baha explained that he had been invited to speak in America by peace societies, and he says in the Persian original of Mahmud's diary, this Asra is the Asra of light and the Karn of mysteries. In Asra, Asra nur ast, wa Karne Asra. which in Sohrab's translation is, "As this century is the century of light and the cycle of the revelation of mysteries, undoubtedly these glorious aims will be fully established." Abdu'l-Baha has used Asra and Khan as two synonyms for the sake of variation. Sohrab has used century and cycle for variation. Sohrab also inserted the revelation of, which is an interpretation. Abdu'l-Baha said simply, "This is the age of mysteries." The convention of using century of light and century to translate Asra and Khan continued in the following years, but it is not as clear as might appear at first glance. In one early example, Sohrab in July 1913 is supposedly translating Abdu'l-Baha's words as reported in Persian in Mahmud's diary for March 26 or 27, 1912. Glad tidings, the prophecies of the holy books have been fulfilled. Glad tidings, the age of human brotherhood is dawning upon mankind. Glad tidings, the century of light and universal peace has come. The problem is, these three lines are not there in Mahmud's diary. Moreover, age of human brotherhood is a typical idea from Sohrab's own diary and letters. It looks as if the three lines, including the century of light, is another interpolation. From April 1913, Sohrab was popularizing the idea that the 20th century was remarkable in his letters, which were often published in Star of the West and circulated in typescript form. Sohrab's approach to translation gives us not what Abdu'l-Baha said when he was in America, but rather what Abdu'l-Baha might have said if he were an American. It's a cultural transposition rather than a translation in the strict sense. On February 8, 1913, he refers to Abdu'l-Baha as the alchemist of the 20th century. On April 23, he says, "There has been an age of scholasticism, another age belonging to the development of philosophy and natural sciences. The last age was the age of freedom and the march of democracy throughout many lands. But this 20th century is the century of the promotion of international peace, the proclamation of the oneness of the world of humanity." On October 8, he says, "The Baha'i ideals are the noblest and most luminous principles of the 20th century." On March 9, 1914, he reports a pilgrim asking Abdu'l-Baha, "How long will it take before the religionists come to believe?" And Abdu'l-Baha responds, according to Sohrab, "God willing, in the 20th century. The rays of the sun of reality will dispel these clouds, and all things will be seen in the light of this universal consciousness." It is good practice to use the reports in Star of the West in preference to those in Promulgation, because of tampering by the editor of Promulgation. The Star of the West reports are now easily accessible and searchable online at Bahai Works. Bahai Works is a tool that everyone seriously interested in Baha'i studies in English should be familiar with. Having said that, there are talks in Promulgation that are not in Star of the West. One report is stated to be a modern translation by Amin Banani from the Persian, and others look like they might have been translated from the Persian notes when Promulgation was first assembled. The same is true of Abdu'l-Baha in London and Paris Talks. There is some authentic material there, but only those who can read Persian can identify it. I searched the many works of Abdu'l-Baha in the Persian part of the Baha'i Reference Library and found not a single place where Abdu'l-Baha uses 20th in combination with age, century, era, or the like. In the Promulgation of Universal Peace, which represents the talks of Abdu'l-Baha in North America, Abdu'l-Baha supposedly refers to the 20th century in 6 talks. but not once in the Persian notes. It is therefore not necessary to check each talk and promulgation against the earlier English version in Star of the West to see what has been changed by MacNutt, because every instance in which Abdu'l-Baha supposedly refers in the English to the 20th century, in his talks and writings, is either inserted by the translator or by the note-taker or editor, or it is a report of a talk by Abdu'l-Baha for which there are no Persian notes. Every instance is unauthentic in one of these three ways, because there is no such reference in all of his Persian writings and talks. Howard MacNutt was also the person who introduced the idea that the House of Justice would be the consummate union and blending of church and state, an idea that comes purely from his own fantasies, and is the opposite of what Abdu'l-Baha taught in his book, The Art of Governance. If you want to know what Abdu'l-Baha taught, you should avoid the promulgation of universal peace entirely. If you want to know what Abdu'l-Baha did in his travels, there are better books and videos for that. The example I mentioned of the convention of using century to translate Asra was in Ahmad Sohrab's report. That came from the voyage of the Cedric, the ship carrying Abdu'l-Baha to North America. When Abdu'l-Baha was in California in October 1912, there are many reports of talks in which he is translated as referencing this radiant century and similar expressions. His translators at that time were Ahmad Sohrab, born in 1890, and Amin Farid, or Aminullah Farid, born in 1885. They travelled with Abdu'l-Baha to California and alternated as interpreters for Abdu'l-Baha's talks. Although Farid was only 5 years older than Sohrab, he had been working as a Baha'i translator from 1901, whereas Sohrab only became Abdu'l-Baha's secretary and interpreter in 1912. So Sohrab is likely to have adopted Farid's translation choices rather than vice versa. As we have seen, Farid probably translated the 1907 version of the Seven Candles tablet, which links the union of nationalities in the fifth candle to this century. Farid was the interpreter for Abdu'l-Baha's first talk in California on October 3, 1912, in which, according to Star of the West report, he translated Abdu'l-Baha as referencing the breaths of the Holy Spirit, which in this radiant century have become apparent and resplendent. There are no Persian notes for this talk. I do not think Farid could have intended this radiant century to be understood as the 20th century. What do you think? If you think the breaths of the Holy Spirit became apparent from the year 1900, why do you think that? Are you thinking at all? As I said, thoughtless is the kindest word for readings that insert the 20th century where it cannot possibly fit. Farid was again the translator when Abdu'l-Baha spoke at the Congregation Emmanuel Synagogue in San Francisco on October 12, 1912. According to the Star of the West report, he concluded with the words, "The age, Karn, is ours, when fellowship is to be established. The century, Karn, has come when all the religions are to be unified," or more literally, when all the religions of the world will be in perfect peace. And then the report says, "The century has come when all the nations shall enjoy international peace. The century has come when all the races and tribes of the world will do away with racial prejudice and associate perfectly. The century has arrived when all the nativities of the world will prove to be one home of the human family." Farid has embroidered freely on what Abdu'l-Baha said, according to the Persian notes of this talk. Those last three sentences are his invention, or perhaps inserted by the editors of Star of the West. This section shows that Abdu'l-Baha used the word qarn, which is literally a span of time, and Farid translated it as century, 5 times, when the original had it just twice. Earlier in that talk, he reports Abdu'l-Baha as saying, "Praise be to God, the medieval ages of darkness have passed away, and this century of radiance has dawned. This century when the reality of things is becoming evident. This century wherein science has discovered the very mysteries of nature. This century which is in toto a service to the world of humanity. This century wherein we have established the foundations of the world of humanity." This is a free elaboration on Abdu'l-Baha's words recorded and approved by him in Persian. I'll put those words on the screen. Farid has inserted the medieval ages of darkness and translated qarn as century. I do not see anything in Farid's translation to indicate that he thought the century of radiance was the 20th century, or any period as short as 100 years. It seems unlikely that Farid or Sohrab thought that Abdu'l-Baha was referring to the 20th century in any of these examples, or in any instance I have seen. It seems unlikely because if they did, they would have to say why the Holy Spirit was apparent from the year 1900, and not, for example, from 1844 or 1863. They would have to say why the century of radiance dawned in 1900, when Baha'u'llah appeared in 1817 or 1863. Furthermore, Farid and Sohrab were both multilingual, familiar with at least the Islamic lunar calendar, the Persian solar calendar, the Syrian calendar, and the Gregorian calendar. They could not look at the word century and just assume that it refers to a Gregorian century. So when did this century morph into the 20th century? I found the first example later in 1912. It's a newspaper report of what an interpreter said that Abdu'l-Baha had replied to a reporter. Abdu'l-Baha was asked, "Are there any signs that the permanent peace of the world will be established in anything like a reasonable period?" "It will be established in this century," he answered. "It will be universal in the 20th century." This is from an interview with a newspaper reporter, printed in the Montreal Daily Star for September 11, 1912. A newspaper report from those days would be super flimsy grounds for turning this century into the 20th century. When reading historical material, one must know about the persons and organizational structures and physical means by which reports are produced. For all we know, it was neither the interpreter nor the reporter who inserted 20th, but rather a desk editor at the newspaper, or a typesetter who needed to fill out a line to make the layout neat. What we do know is that there is no reference to the 20th century in Abdu'l-Baha's Persian works, including the Persian notes of what he said. Why should there be? He did not use the Gregorian calendar. And why would he suppose that God, or destiny, would use the Gregorian calendar? But that newspaper report probably had no effect on Baha'i thinking at the time. It was not quoted in Star of the West, although other reports in the Daily Star are republished there. It was not quoted in any of the works on the Baha'i Works website. It enters the record mainly around the year 2000 as a retrospective explanation of why Baha'is expected great things to happen by the year 2000. It was quoted in 1987 in Abdu'l-Baha in Canada, pages 34 to 35, and then requoted from there. Gary Matthews quotes it in 1993 in his book The Challenge of Baha'u'llah, and the World Centre publication Century of Light, a book based entirely on a false premise, requoted it in 2001. It is quoted in a memorandum from the Research Department in 2001 and reprinted in Messages from the Universal House of Justice, 1986 to 2001, in section 356. Jack McLean has a comment on this newspaper report in his 2003 paper, Did Prophecy Fail? The Lesser Peace and the Year 2000. He says, "It is important not to twist Abdu'l-Baha's reported statement to refer to some form of world unity. Whatever the connections may be between world unity and world peace, this is clearly a statement about world peace. If one considers that World War II was the last global conflict," this is Jack speaking, not me, "if one considers that World War II was the last global conflict in which, as following the methods of classical warfare, alliances between nations were made and battles fought, then we might say that this prophecy of Abdu'l-Baha has been fulfilled, although serious objections might well be raised to this statement." Hello? Jack? Wake up and spell the cordite. Universal peace was not finalized in the 20th century. Sorry, would that it was all over now, but we are not even close. Somehow Jack did not ask himself whether a newspaper report of words that an interpreter said were what Abdu'l-Baha was saying might simply be unreliable. In fact, he does no examination of the sources in the sense that I am doing here. Perhaps he thinks about the sources somewhat, but when I examine the sources, I first show them the instruments of torture. Then I stretch them on the rack and go for their soft spots with sharp, pointy questions as hot as can be. Jack may know about source critical methods, but he doesn't have the habit of using them. Source criticism, along with close contextual reading, are the two pillars of scholarship, and the source criticism has to come first. First, find out how the text originated, how it was transmitted, how it changed, and then understand what was originally being said to whom, and why it was important to say it then. Theology comes after that. Theology is when we think about what it means for us today. As I said, the Montreal Report went unremarked for decades, until American Baha'is became sensitive to the end of the century idea around 1990. As to why that should be, I could blame the decline of educational standards or the effects of lead pollution on intelligence quotients. But there's a simpler explanation. The Baha'is in America were looking for a message that would get attention in the market of current ideas. In the 1980s, the end of the world was a thing. The film The Omen was released in 1976. It concerned the end times predicted in the Book of Revelation through premillennialist spectacles. Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, was a bestseller, and the author starred in a box office hit with Orson Welles narrating. Computers were the mark of the beast. In the sequel, Countdown to Armageddon, Lindsey predicted that the decade of the 1980s could very well be the last decade of history as we know it. In Protestant Christianity in America, dispensationalist thinking moved from a fringe to the mainstream. The American Baha'is were producing an inverse image of the apocalyptic, a healthy counter to the pessimism of their time, but based on the same premise that the end days were nigh. They were trying to be as sexy as Left Behind, and they went looking in the Baha'i literature, and they found what they needed to find. I must note one curious silence. On August 1st, 1912, the Star of the West published an account of a reception for Abdu'l-Baha held by the New York Peace Society at Hotel Astor on May 13, 1912. These words are attributed to Abdu'l-Baha. "Let this century be the sun of previous centuries, the effulgences of which shall last forever, so that in the times to come they shall glorify the 20th century, saying that the 20th century was the century of lights, the 20th century was the century of life, the 20th century was the century of international peace, the 20th century was the century of divine bestowals, and the 20th century has left traces which shall last forever." There are no Persian notes, but Muhammad Zakarni has a brief report of the meeting, and the Boston Evening Transcript for May 14 has a longer report on page 12, which approximates to the wording in the Star of the West report, but stops just before the section quoted above. It stops just before this with "The banner of international peace will be unfurled here." So I can't say whether the words quoted were part of the original or added later. I can say that they cannot be authenticated from Persian originals. The report from Star of the West in August 1912 of Abdu'l-Baha's words at Hotel Asta were republished often. In the Promulgation of Universal Peace in 1922, in Baha'i Scriptures in 1923, in Baha'i World Volume 1 in 1925, in Baha'i World Faith in 1943 and several reprints, in Foundations of World Unity in 1945 and several reprints. Yet I have not seen it quoted in the secondary Baha'i literature. It is almost as if Baha'i authors discounted it, or were not interested in the topic, until it was included in Elaine LaCroix Hobson's 1987 book, Abdu'l-Baha in New York, on page 87, and the Universal House of Justice cited this talk in its Rizwan message for 1998. There's more detailed evidence that century and this wondrous age, this glorious century, in Abdu'l-Baha's vocabulary, do not refer to the 20th century on my Baha'i Studies blog under Century's End. I've explained there the Persian terms that are used, and how they are used by Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, and how they are translated by Shoghi Effendi. After the interpreters and translators have made their choices, the readers, or those in the audience hearing what Abdu'l-Baha's interpreter said, make their interpretations. In this section, I want to draw attention to two important turns in the reading. The first is easier to identify because it is explicit in the words of Baha'i authors up to the present. This century becomes this 20th century. Century of light becomes 20th century of light, and so on, in the writings of European Baha'is and in the oral teaching that transmits a consensus view, for example in summer school programs. The second turn is more subtle. When Abdu'l-Baha was speaking and writing, his immediate audience prior to World War I and the Great Depression heard a message of hope and excitement. A new day had dawned, new potentials were apparent, the old ways, and for Americans, the old world, were releasing their hold. They, the people of 1905 or 1910 or 1912, had the privilege of being in on the ground floor, building something new. Consider again the letter to some Baha'i woman that I showed on screen before. In this century, the century of the Almighty Lord, the light of truth shineth in its meridian splendor. For this is the age of the ancient beauty. In the ages to come, this present century shall stand unrivaled, for it has witnessed the breaking of that morn and the rising of that sun. This century is verily the source of his light and the dayspring of his revelation. For Abdu'l-Baha, this century or this age is about new beginnings. Along with the insertion of 20th in the understanding of Abdu'l-Baha's message, I see a turn from beginnings to endings. The Baha'is start to look forward to the end of the century, the end of turmoil, the end of the incomprehensible random ricochets of history. For those who were hearing Abdu'l-Baha speaking of beginnings, it didn't really matter whether the century of the Almighty Lord or this present century, the breaking of the morn, began in 1863, when Baha'u'llah declared his message, or 1844, when the Baha'i calendar began, or, implausibly, in the year 1900. Whenever it began, they were there in the early exciting days. This observation, I think, explains and largely excuses Farid and other translators who interpreted Abdu'l-Baha as saying, "This century is the century of light," or "The breaths of the Holy Spirit have become apparent in this radiant century," or words to that effect. Century or age, it was a nuance that made no difference to them or their readers, because it was now. But the enders were hearing the message that their suffering and bewilderment was about to end. So the date of the end was interesting. It was a fascination. We've been talking about Abdu'l-Baha's talks and what readers have made of them. The same work could be done with Abdu'l-Baha's letters. One example is on the screen. Abdu'l-Baha says that assemblies for women are one of the characteristics of this glorious dispensation and this great century. It would be a thoughtless reader who thought that this meant that having assemblies for Baha'i women was a characteristic of the 20th century. But back to our Baha'i authors and what they said about this century. Starting in April 1919, when Albert Vail gave a talk on Abdu'l-Baha at the Baha'i Congress in New York. It was published in Star of the West in April 1920. He says, among other things, "The 20th century is the great resurrection day for all nations. The Spirit of Christ is risen again." The first edition of the Promulgation of Universal Peace was published in 1922. I have already commented on the creative editing that went into this book. It has the 20th century stamped all over it, and in every instance, it is an unauthenticated report. In 1923, Elizabeth Herrick published a book called Unity Triumphant. It was published in London, but the publication was announced with an address for postal orders in Star of the West, and its contents were quoted by other authors in Star of the West. It ran to a second edition in 1925. She devoted a chapter to the radiance of the 20th century. She attributes to Abdu'l-Baha the words, "For every age there is destined a great movement, which is the sum total or expression of that age. In the 19th century, freedom and liberty and human brotherhood were proclaimed. But the radiance of the 20th century, into which we have entered, is unity and harmony." Notice that the beginning of this, "For every age there is a great movement," but then age becomes a Gregorian century in what follows. If we credit this report of Abdu'l-Baha's words, and I give it no credence whatever, Abdu'l-Baha believed that the tides of intellectual history ebb and flow with the Gregorian calendar. This quote goes on for several pages. So far as I can detect, it is all fabricated, with some input from Sohrab's words in his diary of April 23, 1913, which made the 19th century the century of democracy and the 20th century the century of international peace. John Esselmont's 1923 edition of Baha'u'llah and the New Era quotes Abdu'l-Baha saying, "This century is the century of the Son of Truth. This century is the century of the establishment of the kingdom of God upon the earth." Esselmont appears to gloss this century as the 20th century, since he says this consummation is near at hand and will come about during the present century. In November 1928, an editorial in Star of the West said, "No flights of the imagination can equal the achievements of reality before the 20th century shall reach its glorious close in an epoch of brotherhood of man and of love and knowledge of God." In July 1931, another editorial said, "International ideals in the realm of politics have been increasing rapidly since the beginning of the 20th century. For this century, as Abdu'l-Baha stated, is the century of new and universal nationhood. Sciences have advanced, industries have progressed, politics have been reformed, Liberty has been proclaimed. Justice is awakening. This is the century of motion, divine stimulus and accomplishment, the century of human solidarity and altruistic service, the century of universal peace, and the reality of the divine kingdom. The editors in that case are inserting 20th into a report of a talk by Abdu'l-Baha on May 24, 1912 in Massachusetts, as printed in the Promulgation of Universal Peace. When George Townshend wrote The Promise of All Ages in 1934, he was not full of joy at the new day dawning. He said that in the 20th century, doomsday has come upon us. He stated in his introduction that his topic would be the unity of mankind and the establishment in this century of a universal and permanent peace. He also says, towards the end of his introduction, the proposition, which was the starting point of Abdu'l-Baha's message to the West, and which filled the background of all his addresses, was the announcement of Baha'u'llah that God had, in this age, fulfilled his ancient promise, so that within this 20th century universal peace would be attained. In fact, he believed that all of Baha'u'llah's predictions would be completely fulfilled in the 20th century. He writes, in these letters, Baha'u'llah incorporated certain predictions. Some indicate an early fulfillment, others look farther into the future. All are to be realized within a measurable time, not later, it appears, than the end of this century. Well, all that historical material was to illustrate what was going on between April 1907, when Farid's translation of the Seven Candles letter was published in the Review of Reviews for London, and March 1941, when Shoghi Effendi quoted and explained the fifth candle section. His translation reads, "The fifth candle is the unity of nations, a unity which in this century will be securely established, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland." That's in The Promised Day Has Come, page 121. Shoghi Effendi illuminates this by citing Some Answered Questions, where Abdu'l-Baha foretells, "All nations will be gathered together under the shadow of this divine banner, which is no other than the lordly branch itself, and will become a single nation. Religious and sectarian antagonism, the hostility of races and peoples, and differences among nations will be eliminated. All men will adhere to one religion, will have one common faith, will be blended into one race, and become a single people. All will dwell in one common fatherland, which is the planet itself." As you can see, this is much, much more than the political arrangements to end war that Baha'is call the lesser peace. Note the last sentence, all will dwell in one common fatherland. That sounds like the fifth candle, doesn't it? Then Shoghi Effendi says, this is the stage which the world is now approaching, the stage of world unity, which, as Abdu'l-Baha assures us, will in this century be securely established. Remember, he has just quoted his translation of the fifth candle, the unity of nations, which in this century will be securely established. And he says this is the stage mentioned in Some Answered Questions, when all will dwell in one common fatherland. I don't see any other way to read this, but that Shoghi Effendi thought that the unity of nations in the seven candles, when all the peoples would regard themselves as citizens of one fatherland, was Abdu'l-Baha's shorter wording for the vision that he outlined at about the same time in Some Answered Questions. There Abdu'l-Baha says, all will become a single nation. Religious and sectarian antagonism will be eliminated. All men will adhere to one religion, will be blended into one race and become a single people. All will dwell in one common fatherland, which is the planet itself. And Shoghi Effendi translated the fifth candle as saying that this unity, called the unity of nations, will be securely established in this century. Shoghi Effendi does not equate this century with the 20th century. In fact, his maximal reading of what Abdu'l-Baha meant by unity of nations pushes it into the far future, when not only have differences among nations been eliminated, prejudices have evaporated. Everyone considers themselves to be part of one religion and one race, living in one homeland. I will leave Shoghi Effendi's words on the screen for a bit so you can think about the connections. After Shoghi Effendi wrote "The Promised Day Has Come," there is a rather long pause in the end of century thinking in English Baha'i literature, until it was unintentionally revived in 1984, when the International Teaching Centre quoted a 1976 letter to an individual from the Secretariat at the Bahai World Centre. That is, a letter on behalf of the Universal House of Justice, saying that Abdu'l-Baha anticipated that the lesser peace could be established before the end of the 20th century. In 1976, I had flowers in my hair, and I was doing my best to catch the tail end of the spirit of '69. The idea of living into the 21st century had something of science fiction about it. The Secretariat statement in 1976 is located in what was then the never never of the far future. However, the ITC's 1984 letter went to the Continental Board of Councillors in the Americas, which is why I think we could say that the end of century hype in the Baha'i community begins around 1984. It's a rough date. In 1983, Helen Hornby's Light of Guidance had also published the 1976 letter to an individual under the heading Calamities and Crisis. So the fire of year 2000 enthusiasm was already lit. The Universal House of Justice stoked the fire. On June 23, 1983, the Universal House of Justice wrote to the youth, saying, "This generation of Baha'i youth enjoys a unique distinction. You will live your lives in a period when the forces of history are moving to a climax, when mankind will see the establishment of the lesser peace, and during which the cause of God will play an increasingly prominent role in the reconstruction of human society." The same words were sent to the European Youth Conference in Innsbruck on July 4, 1983. In January 3, 1984, they alerted the Baha'i youth to the approaching end of the 20th century. Undoubtedly, it is within your power to contribute significantly to shaping the societies of the coming century. Youth can move the world, adding, "The approaching end of the 20th century is significant, as Abdu'l-Baha predicted that the unity of nations will be achieved in the 20th century." At Rizwan, 1985, they said, "The drive towards world unity is one of the dominant, pervasive features of life on the planet during the closing years of the 20th century." That hasn't aged very well, has it? But a 1987 statement from the Baha'i international community also says, "A resurgence of fanatical religious fervor and its attendant violence is one of the outstanding social phenomena distinguishing the closing years of the 20th century." So it was not all Pollyanna thinking at the Baha'i World Centre. The Rizwan message of 1990 begins, "We stand at the threshold of the last decade of this radiant 20th century, facing an immediate future of immense challenges and dazzling prospects. World society finds itself in a critical phase. The winds of God rage on. In the closing decade of the 20th century, the situation is a bright portent. It is portentous of the profound change in the structure of present-day society, which attainment to the lesser peace implies. Hopeful as are the signs, we cannot forget that the dark passage of the age of transition has not been fully traversed. And they say that there are two challenges: to teach the cause of God and build its institutions, and to complete the construction work at the Baha'i World Centre. They anticipate imminent, large-scale enrolments around the world and conclude that there are indications that the lesser peace cannot be too far distant. In the Rizwan message of 1992, they repeat this near approach of the lesser peace, but also warn of countervailing forces: nationalism, racism, and religious fundamentalism. Implicitly, these forces could delay the lesser peace. In February 1999, the Baha'i international community reiterates that Baha'is view the 20th century with all its disasters as the century of light. The 20th century saw the unity of the human race establish itself as a guiding principle of international order. The system of international order that has emerged from the harrowing experiences of the 20th century, they say, is gratifying. And that too hasn't aged very well. In Peace Among the Nations, the Baha'i international community assert that peace among the nations will be established in the 20th century, and that's dated March 20, 1999. The very next day, which was the Baha'i New Year, saw the first flight right around the world in a hot air balloon. What an amazing coincidence. Hot air rocks. In June of 1999, John Huddleston published an article called Another Look at Achieving Peace by the Year 2000. He cites the 1912 report in the Montreal Daily Star that I mentioned earlier. That report went unremarked at the time, until it was picked up in 1987 in the book Abdu'l-Baha in Canada. John Huddleston calls it a promise of Abdu'l-Baha. Oh, John, are you listening? If Abdu'l-Baha wanted to send a significant promise to the Baha'i community, he would not have it delivered by a newspaper reporter. It would be written and repeated in numerous works so that all his scattered readers could know about it. John Huddleston is at least sober about the prospects for peace at that time. He concedes that it is totally unrealistic to talk of ending war in the foreseeable future, but thinks it reasonable to understand the above-quoted promise as referring to creating conditions that will result in a significant reduction in the incidence of violence. This tactic for dealing with the failed promise has been repeated by later writers. Instead of examining the so-called promise to see whether it is authentic and really does specify the Western 20th century, authors dilute the definitions of peace, unity of nations, and lesser peace to the point of being meaningless. This is not satisfying to any critical thinker, and not a solution anyway, since there has not been even a significant reduction in the incidence of violence, let alone unity of nations or the lesser peace. The year 2000 came and went, and nothing very remarkable happened. What to do? Nothing, of course. What to say? On April 19, 2001, a letter on behalf of the Universal House of Justice addressed the fact that the promise had not been fulfilled by December in the year 2000. The writers are now aware that there is nothing in the authoritative Bahai writings to indicate that the lesser peace would be established before the end of the 20th century. That corrects the ITC's 1984 letter and the Baha'i International Community's assertion in March 1999. You might think, thank goodness, somebody has finally checked to see whether Abdu'l-Baha talks about the 20th anything. Well, no such luck. The letter continues, however, there are clear statements affirming the unity of nations would be, in the words of Abdu'l-Baha, securely established during the 20th century. I swear to God it's true. They've gone back to check the text, as Shoghi Effendi translated it, and found the fifth candle is the unity of nations, a unity which in this century will be securely established. And they've noticed that it says unity of nations, not lesser peace, but they've not noticed that somebody omitted the word 20th. It's not there. So they conclude that if Abdu'l-Baha promised unity of nations in the 20th century, and it's now the 21st century, then unity of nations must mean this shambles we see around us. But only special people with spiritual eyes, such as they, can see it. They see it and assert, there can be no doubt that the promise of Abdu'l-Baha has been fulfilled and the unity of nations securely established in the century now concluded. After the 2001 letter, claiming that the unity of nations had been securely established in the 20th century, other Baha'i authors weighed in. In 2002, William Collins wrote an article in the Journal of Baha'i Studies called Apocalypse and Millennium. In a footnote he tells us, I took a convenient, non-scientific sample at the annual conference of the Association of Baha'i Studies. Of approximately 100 Baha'is present, about 95% indicated that at some point in their Baha'i lives, they had believed that the lesser peace would be established by the end of the 20th century. Those who expected the catastrophe during the 20th century constituted less than 10%. Thank you, William. That's useful research. In the paper, he correctly says that Baha'is anticipate that there will be a centuries-long period when the simultaneous processes of disintegration and integration operate. This is incompatible with a sudden and imminent establishment of peace by divine intervention. That's good. He is pointing out the inconsistency of the year 2000 expectations with Shoghi Effendi's broader vision of historical continuity. And he's sober. He says, the view that humanity had suffered its greatest calamities by the end of the 20th century seems naive at best. Yet he doesn't realize that the more catastrophic strand of millennialism in the American Baha'i community and its link to the Western 20th century was unscriptural, based on unauthentic texts, misleading translations, and reading in Christian millennialist ideas that would not have entered the head of Abdu'l-Baha or Shoghi Effendi. He quotes Abdu'l-Baha's fifth candle and then says, only unity of nations is linked to a specific time period, the 20th century. The fact that 20th is not there in the text he has just quoted escapes his notice. In 2003, Jack McLean gives a presentation called Did Prophecy Fail? At the conference of the Association of Baha'i Studies. This begins well by acknowledging that popular understandings did not materialize as expected. This disconnect calls for a re-examination of the scriptures. But then he doesn't re-examine the scriptures to ask, where does it say 20th? He doesn't ask about the meaning of century in the Bahai Writings. He supposes a century to be a period of 100 years and supposes that the references to this century in the Bahai Writings refer to the 20th century. In 2004, Ali Naqshbandi gave 6 talks on the World Order of Baha'u'llah, which were published in 2005 under the title Towards World Order. He references the 7 candles and says, "This tablet was revealed in the year 1906. This date is important because Abdu'l-Baha refers in this tablet to this century in connection with one of the candles, namely the one of the unity of nations, and it is clear he was referring to the 20th century. If Mr. Nakshivani was still with us, he died in 2019, we could ask him, when Abdu'l-Baha refers to this century in a work written in 1892, saying, "This century, Karan, is the chosen century of the one true God," would you say he must be referring to the 19th century? Because 1892 is in the 19th century. Is that the argument, Mr. Nakshivani? Then he includes unity of nations as one of the candles that are, in his words, beyond any doubt preliminary steps towards the lesser peace. He knows it is preliminary because the lesser peace isn't here, but unity of nations must have happened before the year 2000 because he thinks it must. It's circular and it's an illogical expectation. The example of the European Union shows us that the political peace, the lesser peace, precedes the consciousness of one homeland by several generations. Shoghi Effendi has explained in The Promised Day Has Come what he thinks it means to live in one fatherland. All nations and kindreds will be gathered together under the shadow of this divine banner. All men will adhere to one religion, will have one common faith, will be blended in one race, and so forth. And what is the precondition for this highly desirable paradise? The lesser peace. The lesser peace is the precondition for having one common fatherland. And The Promised Day Has Come, Shoghi Effendi writes of a gradual process that must lead at first to the establishment of that lesser peace. This will bring in its wake the spiritualization of the masses, which is the essential condition to that ultimate fusion of all races, creeds, classes, and nations. So Shoghi Effendi expects the sequence: spiritualization of the masses and the fusion of races, creeds, and nations. And Shoghi Effendi has said that the fusion of races and faiths makes the world one common fatherland. And this is unity of nations, the 5th candle. Ali Nakshivani has this all back to front and upside down. The 5th candle for him is a precondition for the lesser peace. He continues, claiming that unity in the political realm has certainly been realized through the establishment of the United Nations. Would that it were so, and that unity of nations is a recognition that we are all citizens of one common fatherland, and that this was fully realized during the 20th century. These excuses were a stretch of credulity. Something had to give, and it did. On January 18, 2019, the Universal House of Justice wrote a letter addressed to the Baha'is of the world, reflecting on the centenary of the end of World War I. The letter points to 3 points at which the world seemed to almost achieve peace, only to fail. They refer to the League of Nations, the United Nations, and the end of the Cold War towards the end of the 20th century. This was the 3rd moment when universal peace seemed to be within grasp. They say, as the present century opened, new challenges began to loom, leading to a retreat from the promising steps forward with which the previous century had closed. Today, many of the dominant currents in societies everywhere are pushing people apart, not drawing them together. Shared ethical principles, which seemed to be in the ascendant at the start of this century, are eroded, threatening the prevailing consensus about right and wrong. The will to engage in international collective action, which 20 years ago represented a powerful strain of thinking among world leaders, has been cowed, assailed by resurgent forces of racism, nationalism, and factionalism. Thus do the forces of disintegration regroup and gain ground. The course humanity takes to achieve its destiny may very well be tortuous. The tumult raised by the contending peoples of the earth threatens to drown out the voices of those noble-minded souls in every society who call for an end to conflict and struggle. As long as that call goes unheeded, there is no reason to doubt that the world's current state of disorder and confusion will worsen, possibly with catastrophic consequences, until a chastened humanity sees fit to take another significant step, perhaps this time decisive, towards enduring peace. Compare that to Ali Nakjavani's alternate universe, in which unity in the political realm has certainly been realized, and the recognition that we are all citizens of one common fatherland was fully realized during the 20th century. I welcome the new realism, but it's still not based on a careful examination of the sources and what Shoghi Effendi has said about them, to reach an understanding of what Abdu'l-Baha taught in 1900, in 1912, in 1920. What I see is quite a large group of people, not just the members of the Universal House of Justice, not just one or two crackpot authors, convincing themselves that what they expect to happen must be happening. Naturally, this muddled thinking has been reflected on the popular level. One Baha'i told a newspaper reporter in 1992, "By the year 2000 we will have the lesser peace, which will be political acceptance of Baha'ism and a world political system." Multiply that example with the tens of thousands of similar conversations Baha'is were holding around the world, and think how it sounded to the listeners. What the Baha'is were saying before and after the year 2000 sounded totally ridiculous to anyone outside the community bubble. The English-speaking Baha'i community wandered out of touch with reality and out of touch with ordinary people. The Baha'is themselves, through their unthinking and unscriptural ideas, became a barrier to people hearing what Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha really have to say to the world, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the 20th century. After the year 2000, a lot of Baha'is were greatly disappointed. Although I had spent the previous 5 years warning everyone who would listen that the idea of great events by the year 2000 was rubbish, after the event I was saying that we, meaning the Baha'is on email lists such as Baha'i Apologetics and Talisman 9, we should not be drawing attention to the fact that the House of Justice and a number of its members had been saying things about the 20th century that had no basis in the authentic Bahai writings. So why am I returning to the Missa of the century now? Why this now overly long video? First, 25 years have passed. The House of Justice members now are not those of 25 years ago, and a good portion of the Baha'is now do not remember the drama of expectations around the year 2000. We are looking back a generation, which should hardly cause a crisis of faith today. However, the value of this cautionary example is no less. The first part of wisdom is to know yourself. People want to have an imminent expectation of a great change coming, so they make it for themselves. You can't blame religious language for this. It is what people make their religion into. And when the promise they made for themselves fails, they make a new one. That's why Moses had the golden calf ground up and eaten. A mere meltdown doesn't prevent recasting. From the century fiasco, we can learn to check sources, to distrust the promulgation of universal peace, to remember that a translation is not the original, and that the original comes from a different world of thought, because each language is a thought world. As a minimum, we need to use multiple source texts and not rely on a translation of any one verse. Better than that is to correlate each translation with its original, which means, even in the age of AI translations, learning Persian and Arabic. The community needs to develop new understandings in some areas and heightened awareness in others. For example, using the writings as a crystal ball to tell the future is futile. Scripture is not inerrant without qualification. Infallibility is a moral quality. It means doing no wrong, rather than never being wrong. Only authenticated scripture is reliable, and the Universal House of Justice does not have any special understanding of the Baha'i teachings, and it doesn't claim to have special insight. That was the role of the Guardian, who did provide the necessary explanation. But then people stopped listening. My second reason for reviewing the shambles of the century here is as a case study for good method in Baha'i studies. Good method is simply good reading, wide reading, reading in context. It means carefully not reading what is not on the page. This century is not this 20th century. Good reading is mindful of the difference between a translation and an original. Good reading means casting a net widely over all the sources, looking especially for apparent contradictions. Good reading means dating every bit of evidence, because one cannot read in context without putting things in chronological order. When things are in order, a conversation is revealed. Who asked what? What was said in response? What was the follow-up? Understanding the texts as communications to someone in a conversation often reveals why it was important to say this to this audience. The opposite of good method is picking a verse here and a sentence there, not relating the sentence to the communication it is part of, not dating anything, not checking for parallel sources and translations, throwing dubious sources into the same mix as Shoghi Effendi's translations, and stirring it all to make stew. Bad method has been rare among Baha'i historians and biographers, who generally use the standard rigorous methods. But when I turn to books and articles about Baha'i teachings, I see that work is still being published that could be greatly improved by taking a one-semester course in the methods and techniques of scholarship. However, I am quite optimistic about the development of intellectual rigor in the English-speaking Baha'i community. We have the Wilmette Institute courses, the Corrine True Center's presentations, and a dozen or so YouTube channels that are showing rigorous and intellectually stimulating content. We have the website Bahai Works, and the Afnan Library, and the H. Baha'i Library, and the Baha'i Reference Library, and Baha'i Library Online, all making the source material available. There is a steady flow of Baha'i Studies publications, so we have students and viewers and readers and resources that we could only wish for towards the end of the 20th century. Back then, I was arguing that intellectual development in the Baha'i community would require institutions of Baha'i scholarship, such as libraries and training courses and access to sources. And I got raspberries for saying it. How elitist. Well, see now, those institutions are there, and the sky has not fallen. The community has not been taken over by a class of so-called scholars using presumed authority to impose their ideas on the community. None of the other even nastier things that were said back then have come about. Surprise, surprise. Intellect, knowledge, effort, and method bear good fruit, not bad. By now you've probably got an inkling of why I was disenrolled from the Baha'i community. I'm a contrarian, at least that's how I seem to others. In 2016, the National Spiritual Assembly of New Zealand referred to my persistent efforts spanning over 25 years to promote erroneous and misleading perspectives on the Baha'i teachings. 25 years back would take us to 1993, about the time I made myself unpopular by not jumping on the year 2000 bandwagon. Not long after that, I was voicing suspicions that some of the letters labelled on behalf of Shoghi Effendi were the Secretary's personal correspondence. That has since been confirmed. I was saying that local Baha'i communities should centre around local houses of worship, that there was no rule requiring only one house of worship on each continent. I got roasted for that, but hey, now there are local houses of worship under construction. I argued that the separation of church and state is a basic Baha'i principle. I was ahead of the curve at the time, but in my video called It's a Sign, uploaded here on July 6, 2024, I argue that in 2022, Glenford Mitchell was signalling to the community that it's now okay to talk about the separation of church and state in a Baha'i context. I've argued that the century of light is an idiom of ultimate hope, not a schedule, and no more important than the century of mysteries, or any of the other century idioms that Abdu'l-Baha uses. Today, the idea that the century of light ended in the year 2000 still seems to be embedded in Western Baha'i communities, where it does little harm except to make us look peculiar to the world. I mean, really? The 20th century? The long 18th century was the age of enlightenment and the century of light for Europe. The 20th century was a disaster. I've argued that entry by troops is an idiom rather than a program in the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, and that when the Baha'is later made it a big theme in their futurologies, Shoghi Effendi dampened their optimism. In 1932, a letter on his behalf said, "It is only when the spirit has thoroughly permeated the world that the people will begin to enter the faith in large numbers." And in The Promised Day Has Come, he writes that this consummation will be a gradual process and must, as Baha'u'llah has himself anticipated, lead at first to the establishment of that lesser peace. This will bring in its wake the spiritualization of the masses. So his expectation is first universal recognition of the oneness of humanity, leading to the lesser peace, then the spiritualization of the masses, and then entry by troops. That has not inhibited the Universal House of Justice, who for many years, beginning in 1964, shaped their policies around the expectation of entry by troops. Thankfully, that phase seems to have passed. The idea now is to build a comprehensive, alternative, local-level society, parallel to the old world order. That's another idea that's not present in the Baha'i scriptures. As I said, the institutions of Baha'i scholarship are in better shape today than ever before. The resources are there, although the students are few. The community's understanding inches forward, and the institution's grasp of what is acceptable speech in the Baha'i community slowly matures, but it is so slow and unnecessary. A systematic approach to studying the Baha'i teachings would get us there so much faster. This whole train wreck of expectations for the 20th century could have been prevented with a few drops of good reading skills at the beginning. How do we get more Baha'is undertaking studies such as history and literature and political science, studies that train students to read critically? That's the path to avoiding train wrecks of false expectations. Baha'u'llah talks about the renewal of scholarship in his Surah of the Temple. O heart of this temple, verily we have made thee the rising place of my science and the manifestations of my wisdom. We have made the sciences to appear from thee, and to thee shall we return them. Then they will be sent forth from thee for another occasion, as a promise on our part. We shall raise up from thee people of wonderful sciences and powerful arts. Not everyone is on board with that vision of excellence in scholarship. In one talk given in 2006, Ian Semple, a member of the Universal House of Justice, recalls one meeting of that body. He says, "I remember when it was suggested one day that at some Baha'i institution we should have a course that would lead to a Master in Baha'i Studies. And the House of Justice said, 'This is impossible. You can't have a human being saying, I am a Baha'i and I am a Master of Baha'i Studies. No one is a Master of Baha'i Studies.' So long as people like that are running things, progress in understanding the Baha'i teachings will be disrupted. We will get there, but it won't be easy, which is a crying shame and such a waste. Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha deserve better." Well, that's all I have today. Thank you for the likes and shares and subscribes. If you leave comments, I might incorporate them in a version of this for my Baha'i Studies blog, or leave your comments on my blog under the heading Century's End.